right, let's get into it. We're doing a deep dive today. Global resistance movements. It's a big one, right?
Yes, huge topic.
It is. And it's not always comfortable, to be honest.
No, not at all.
We're using Unmasking Global Hypocrisy to kind of guide us here and looking at how these movements are seen by the world and why there's such a difference in how people react.
Right. It's really striking, actually. The source points out this comparison between South Africa and their fight against apartheid
Right.
and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. And, on the surface, you'd think they'd be viewed kind of the same way, right?
You think so?
But that's not what happens at all.
No, not even close. So the source, it points out these historical parallels.
Yeah.
But then,
Well, both groups, they've gone through systematic oppression,
Yeah.
violence, discrimination.
yeah, and they both ended up, using armed resistance.
Who did to fight for their rights, to fight for what they believed in. So that's really where the similarities kind of stop, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because the ANC, the African National Congress.
Yeah. Eventually the world kind of embraced them, celebrated their victory.
Right, over apartheid.
But then you look at Palestinian groups, often they're just labeled as terrorists.
Yeah, it's a very different response for sure.
Even though, arguably they're fighting for similar things like freedom from oppression, self-determination.
Yeah, they want their own land, their own state.
Isn't there, though, a danger that by just focusing on geopolitics, we oversimplify things?
Oh, for sure. I mean, these situations are incredibly complex. And the tactics, let's be honest, neither movement was perfect, right? Their tactics weren't always universally accepted. There were definitely things that were controversial.
Yeah.
Even with the ANC, there were a lot of Western powers that didn't support them.
Oh, yeah. At first, they were really shunned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big shift came with the end of the Cold War. South Africa strategically wasn't as important anymore, at least not to the West. And so supporting the ANC became...
more convenient. Yeah, more politically acceptable, I guess you could say.
So it sounds like the source is making the argument that when it comes down to it, geopolitics trumps human rights.
Well, it certainly seems to play a massive role in who the world decides to support, who they decide to label a hero, and who they decide to label, well, a terrorist, frankly. And this leads right into the U.S. approach to the Middle East, which the source really goes after. It claims that the U.S. strategy is failing because the world, well, it doesn't accept U.S. dominance the way it used to.
Yeah, it talks about the region as like a brawl.
Yeah, brawl. That's a pretty strong word.
It is.
But it gets the point across, that this isn't a simple good guys, bad guys situation. It's not a binary like it was during the Cold War. It's way more complicated.
Oh, yeah. Multiple power centers, different ideologies clashing, and just a growing, it seems like, rejection of the U.S., like intervening, like they used to.
Absolutely. And this is where the source brings up the axis of resistance, right, led by Iran. Okay,
now, for those of us who don't, spend all day reading about Middle Eastern politics, what is that exactly?
Right. Well, basically, it's a coalition of countries and groups who are opposed to U.S. influence in the region. So you've got Iran, obviously, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, some Palestinian factions as well. They all see U.S. policy as being, way too favorable to Israel at the expense of Palestinian rights and really regional stability, too.
And this axis, this is gaining power.
Yeah. They are,
Okay.
which makes it harder for the U.S. to control the narrative, to control, well, how people see what's happening over there. The source even suggests that the U.S. might be starting to kind of shift its focus.
Away from the Middle East?
Yeah, toward the Asia-Pacific region, which, if that happens, that could leave a vacuum, and then someone else is going to step in. China, probably.
Wow. It's interesting what the source says about the media and how they portray the ANC versus Palestinian resistance.
Oh, yeah. It's like they're on two different planets, totally different universes almost.
It is.
And that framing by the media, it's not just words, it has real consequences in the real world, because when you label someone a terrorist, you're dehumanizing them. You're justifying harsher treatment.
It makes it impossible to even have a conversation.
Right. You can't talk about the nuances of the situation because that label shuts everything down.
But some people argue that, that terrorist label is necessary for national security because it, helps separate the legitimate political actors from the ones who just, use violence. randomly,
Yeah.
indiscriminately.
Yeah, it's a tough question. How do you reconcile that with the idea that the narratives are
Yeah,
biased?
how do you know who's really a terrorist?
Exactly. If you look back at history, the label terrorist, it's been used so inconsistently. Often it's a way to demonize your opponents, basically,
Yeah.
or justify actions that otherwise people wouldn't accept. I mean, look at Nelson Mandela. He was labeled a terrorist by the South African government, by a lot of Western nations too.
And he became, a global icon for peace.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
just shows how powerful these labels are. They really shape how we see the world, but they don't always tell the whole story. And then, of course, now you've got social media, which adds a whole other dimension to this.
Yeah. How does that fit into the idea of narrative control?
Well, it's a game changer, that's for sure. On the one hand, it gives marginalized groups a voice they never had before. They can bypass the traditional media, speak directly to people. On the other hand, it makes it really easy to spread misinformation, propaganda, all kinds of stuff.
So where does that leave us? Like, what are we supposed to do?
I think the first step is just awareness, realizing that nobody has a monopoly on the truth.
Right.
You got to seek out different perspectives, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. Question the labels that people are using.
Don't just accept them.
Yeah. Try to understand, why are they using this label? What's the motivation?
The source ends with, a call to action. Become more informed, get engaged. Don't just sit back and let things happen.
Right. We need to think critically about what we're seeing and hearing.
And be skeptical. Look beyond the surface.
Yeah. Real understanding comes from engaging with a variety of viewpoints, even the ones that challenge our beliefs. That's how we break out of these echo chambers and start to see the world more clearly.
That's a good note to end on. Food for thought, for sure. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.